Um, yeah, so today we're going to talk about how we classify different bones in the body, as well as the histology of bones, kind of the microanatomy, as well as kind of what the tissue of bone looks like. So, yeah, let's dive right into it. So, always like to start with some fun facts about a new system. So, average human skeleton's about 30 pounds. Okay, so good little chunk of our weight. Um, Throughout the day, we shrink about 1/4 of an inch because of our vertebral discs, kind of smash down, dehydrate. We've talked about those discs already. Um, about every 10 years, we have a whole new skeleton. Okay. That's something we don't really think about most of the time, that bones are a very dynamic tissue. They're constantly changing, actually. They're not just like these rocks inside of us that are just permanently there. They're constantly changing. So as we put stress on them, they get stronger in certain spots. As we don't put stress on them, they get weaker in certain spots. But they're also always just turning over, kind of like our skin, right? So we're constantly switching out the cells, switching out the material inside. And the hardness of bone varies quite a bit depending on which bone we're talking about and depending on the stresses that it's designed to handle. So animal bones are similar to ours, but just one kind of crazy example here. Rams, those animals that just run into each other full speed. They have incredibly strong cranial bones. Scientists have studied their cranial bones. They hit each other at about 25 miles an hour, both running 25 miles an hour, just full speed. And they don't crack their skulls when they do that. It's incredibly stiff and rigid. Human skulls fracture at about a 5 mile per hour velocity. So very, very different. Same material, just designed in slightly different ways. We'll talk about some of those ways, how they can be harder or less hard, but then more flexible today. So, all right. So let's talk about the different things that make up the skeletal system. We've got bones, obviously, right? And as you guys have been looking at axial bones and appendicular bones, right? You guys are familiar with those. But then cartilage is considered part of our skeletal system too. And we've looked at that in terms of the histology of cartilage. But yeah, we'll talk about some other types as well. So hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage are the key ones there. Okay, and so again, cartilage is always associated with bone. It's part of our skeletal system. Okay, let's see how many of you guys know this one here. So a sesamoid bone. Go ahead, talk to the people on your team. Decide what you think and send it in on your clickers. All right, go ahead and send in your answer. Give you about 10 more seconds or so. Okay, anybody else? We got 66, almost there. Okay, so 45% of you are saying A, and then we got about 20% each saying B, C, and D. So it is this one right here, a bone that's encased in the tendon. Okay. Who's got an example of one of these for me? Who can raise your hand? Tell me an example. Yeah, Sam. Patella, absolutely. Your kneecap, right? Your patella, that's the sesamoid bone. It's fully encased in a tendon. It's got tendon on the top, on the bottom, on the sides. It's just inside of that tendon. Okay. We've also got one of the bones you guys studied for the practical. What's this one called right here? Pisiform. Yeah, your little pisiform bone is a sesamoid bone too. You can kind of move it around if you feel it. You can't really tell what's moving because your whole wrist kind of moves, but if you kind of lock it in place, you can move it around similar to what you can with your patella. You got a couple underneath your big toe, like if this was my big toe, There's two right here underneath your big toe, underneath the head of your first metatarsal there. And yeah, a couple other places. So they're just kind of unique bones that are totally encased in tendons. They don't connect via ligaments to other bones like most all other bones do. So, okay. All right, sesamoid bone. So let's look at the other primary classifications of bone here. Okay, we've got 4 primary classifications. So long bone, short bone, irregular, and flat. Okay, why don't you just talk about those for a second with the people on your team, see if you can kind of match up which one would be which according to the description there, and then send in the answer to this one on your clickers. Which one of with the examples there do you think is an irregular bone?
Yeah. This is long.
Aloha Friday. There it is. Aloha Friday. You got your shirt on. I didn't wear mine, but
Borrow this.
it's perfect.
Yeah.
That's like a rectangle, really almost squarish.
All right, got about 20 more of you to send it in. Go ahead and just press that button again, just in case. It took me a second to get it started, so if you had already sent it in, maybe just press it one more time. All right, I'll leave it open for another sec here, but about 75% of you are saying B is our irregular bone there. And what kind of bone is that? What do you call that one? Vertebrae, for sure. You guys know that one. Okay. Yeah, well, well then what's A? Which one did you say A was? Long bone, for sure. Okay. And then what about which one of there would be the short bone? Yeah, so yeah, D, good job. So we got D there, irregular bone, just like you said, B. And then the flat bone in that case would be the sternum. We got some other ones like our skull bones, others like that. So yeah, those are just some examples, but kind of the basic description of them there. So yeah, so most of you got that one right with B. Okay, questions on those basic classifications there? Okay, so here's some more examples. Okay, so when we look at, and here's those sesamoids I was telling you about underneath the head of your 5th metatarsal, those little bones there, right by your big toe. Okay, all right, so pretty much all of our limb bones, except for some of those little ones there, are examples of long bones. Right, when we look at short bones, these are carpals, tarsals, sesamoids. They're kind of more somewhat cube-like, cube-shaped, right? And then some of these flat ones, like we talked about, the cranial bones, ribs, scapula, and then irregular vertebrae, and then thos weird shaped os coxa ones that make up the pelvis that you guys looked at. So yeah, just some more examples there. Okay. All right, well, let's look at some functions of bones. Okay. So we've got a bunch of really 5 functions here that are important for bone. Obviously, protection. What's an example of that? Go ahead, Wesley.
The ribs.
The ribs, for sure. What's it protecting there? Okay, yeah, protecting our thoracic cavity. Yeah, so our heart, our lungs, those very important organs, right? Our liver. Yeah, ribs are important for that. What else? What would be some other ones? Skull, for sure, protecting our brain. Vertebrae, right? We got that hole down the middle of our vertebrae where our spinal cord goes, right? So vertebrae are very important for protecting our spinal cord. Okay, yeah, those are some great examples there. Go ahead, Wesley. Yeah.
Would you say the collarbone is also one? Because I know that's like supposed to break before. I think it's your neck, so it's kind of like very compression. So like it's supposed to break before your neck breaks. Could you consider that?
Yeah, I mean I would probably say it. we could probably come up with examples for bones being protective in most cases of bones, especially axial bones, because there's always organs or large blood vessels underneath them. So we could probably come up with examples, but yeah, clavicle would definitely be one that would, especially because there's some important vascular and neurovascular structures right underneath it too. So that it kind of protects that. Yeah, for sure. So other questions on those so far? Yeah, well, then when it comes to support, right? I mean, this is most of our bones, right? If we didn't have bones, then we would just be a big, I don't know, big puddle of tissue, right? Bones are what give us our support, give us our shape. So yeah, pretty much all of our bones do that, right? But definitely our long bones of our limbs, right, really give us support there. Cartilage, very important. So definitely our fibrocartilage, our hyaline cartilage are kind of key ones in support, right? Hyaline being the ones on the end of our bones, but then also hyaline cartilage makes up the connection in the costochondral region, the cartilage in our ribs, right? Our nose, that's all hyaline cartilage, the very, very hard stuff. Fibrocartilage for our menisci, like our menisci in our knee. We have things like that in our shoulder and our hip. Those are all very supportive type structures. And then our vertebral discs, right? Movement, this is one we don't necessarily think about, but we think about our muscles when we think of movement typically, right? But if the muscles don't have a hard lever to pull on, then they don't do anything, right? If they were just pulling on soft tissue, that's tissue would just kind of smash together, right? So we need these hard levers for muscles to pull on, and then we create torque, right? And we move. So without that, we don't move at all, right? So muscles need stiff levers to pull on, right? Okay, blood cell formation. We don't necessarily always think about this one either, but bone marrow is where all of our blood cells are formed. Red blood cells, white blood cells, they all start in the bone marrow, right? Which is kind of brings us to another point of bones protecting important tissue, right? Because it's kind of weird if you think about like why is it in there, right? Why do we have these little stem cells inside of our bone? But it's a very safe place for very important cells to be, right? Because you can't really get to that area without breaking the bone open, right? And so it's this very important tissue, could be in an organ, right? God could have said, let's put that in the liver instead or something, right? But instead it's inside of our bones, right? So this kind of very protected cavity space that's responsible for making our red blood cells, making our white blood cells. So obviously very important. So hematopoiesis is the formation of red blood cells. Okay, and then mineral storage, right? What's the big mineral you think of when you think of bones?
Yeah.
Calcium, right? Yeah, and it's calcium phosphate is really the salt that we're dealing with. Phosphate's very important as well, right? We talked about phosphate being found in our nucleic acids, right? Especially ATP. It's got 3 of them, right? Our form of energy in the body. Okay, and then calcium is very, very important for muscle and nerve function. Without the right levels of calcium in the blood, our heart stops beating pretty quickly, right? Our muscles can't contract. Okay, and so if our calcium levels drop too low, the body can go to the bone, pull some of that calcium out, and replenish our blood calcium levels, and that's exactly what it does. If we got too much calcium, then certain cells will act to pull that calcium out of the blood, put it back into the bone to store for later. So it's a very nice turnover site for calcium. Okay, so constantly being turned over. All right, questions on any of those functions of bone so far? Okay. All right, so a little bit about what the typical bone looks like, okay? On the outside of our bones, we have what's called compact bone. Okay, you can see it's very dense. There's really no pores, visible pores in it, right? And then we get into the middle, which is more spongy bone. Okay, and then on the other side, if we have a flat bone like this shape, then we got more compact bone. Okay, so the spongy bone is always going to be on the inside, on the internal part of it. Okay, and it's got some pores. This is where we're going to find the marrow, right? So this is where red bone marrow is, as well as yellow bone marrow. We'll talk about what those are differently, how those are different in a sec. And then compact bone's always on the outside, right? Very, very dense, very, very hard. gives the bone its the most of its stability, even though the spongy bone also helps with stability too. Okay. All right, so then when we keep looking at these, looking at bones, we see a typical long bone here, right? Which one's this? Femur, right? We're having practical flashbacks. Thought you never had to know that again. No, just kidding. Yeah, that's the femur. Okay. You guys knew that, of course you did. Okay, so we've always got cartilage, as I was talking about before, right? So we've always got hyaline cartilage. A type of hyaline cartilage is articular cartilage. That's a version of hyaline cartilage, which is on the end of our long bones where we have joints, right? So the articular cartilage is a type of hyaline. What does articular make you think of? Joint, right? It's a joint. When you see arts or arthrosis, we'll talk about some of those words, has to do with a joint, right? Where bones come together. Okay. Sometimes we have elastic cartilage associated with bone. Okay. And then sometimes we have fiber cartilage, and we'll talk about more examples of those later. Oops, sorry. On the outside of our bone, we have a membrane called the periosteum. Okay. And we can see that. Yeah, we can see, yeah, guess it's not really showing it that well here. We'll get another view of it a little bit later, but it's pretty much this outside layer, which is a connective tissue layer on the bone. This is kind of what houses nerve fibers as well as blood vessels. Okay. And this is a form of dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, so lots of nerves in the outside of your bone, right? So when you have some kind of trauma directly to bone, like when somebody kicks you in the shin, right? That's maybe your brother or sister did that to you when you're a kid. It's pretty painful, right? Because it's just that periosteum, which has lots of nerves in it and lots of pain receptors there. Okay, and then we've got yellow marrow, mostly in adults, okay, which is really just fat. Okay, it's an energy storage site. So in the middle part of our long bones, that middle part is called the diaphysis. Okay, the diaphysis is this whole section in the middle here. Okay, that's going to be mostly full of lipids in adults. Okay, but in kids, it's going to be all red bone marrow in that, even in the middle of our long bones, because kids are building up their blood supply, right? They're making all their new red blood cells, making all their white blood cells, and so they need a lot of extra tissue that's going to be making all those cells for them. But then eventually, once we kind of have our supply of blood cells, then that tissue eventually just turns into lipid, right? Yeah, so energy storage for the fat part. Red marrow is going to be what's making our red blood cells. We'll come back to these terms of diaphysis and epiphysis a little bit in a sec on another slide. Okay, questions on that so far? Okay, so clicker question here. Go ahead and discuss this with the people on your team, and yeah, go ahead and vote on your best guess here when you're ready. All right, go ahead and send your answer in. Give you about 10 seconds. All right, I think we got almost everybody there. Yeah, so this is kind of the bones, the real human bones you dealt with in lab, really don't have any more of the collagen component left in them because that protein breaks down. They're just the salt, so those are very rigid, right? There's no bending of those bones anymore. But actually, the model like bones that are plastic, those are probably more the level of flexibility that that actual bones would be. Because we have this mix of the salt, which is very rock hard, but then also what's called the organic component of bone, which is the collagen. Okay, so we definitely have collagen protein fibers woven throughout the bone to give it some flexibility, and then secondly, this one too, the bonds that hold those collagen fibers together. Right, remember the big strands of a bunch of protein fibers woven together. When we bend bone, some of those bonds break, but then when the bone goes back to its regular shape, those bonds come back together, and that's actually something known as sacrificial bonds. Okay, it's kind of this unique feature of collagen fibers, especially in bone, that actually just allows them to be pulled apart and then reformed when the bone when that stress is taken off the bone. So yeah, both C and D. Okay, questions on that one? Okay, so the two primary components of bone, about a third of the extracellular matrix in bone um, is what's known as the organic components. Okay, so this is the cells, the osteocytes, we're going to talk about osteoblasts, osteoclasts, um, and then it's this osteoid stuff, which is really the ground substance of bone. Okay, so that contains these things called proteoglycans and glycoproteins. The functions of those is to really create osmotic pressure and hold on to water. And we have this in most of our connective tissue. We have this stuff out there that just its job is just to be a solute that's going to create osmotic pressure that's going to pull water into it, right? And then we got a bunch of collagen, right? Protein fibrils that give it flexibility as well as tensile strength, resisting the like stretching and twisting our bones, allowing some of our bones to do that without breaking. Okay, and all of this osteoid stuff, which is made up of these components here, comes from osteoblasts, the cells that are sending out the osteoid, and then it kind of hardens, turns into these different components here. So that's a third of bone is the organic compounds or organic components. I'll give you a sec to finish writing that. Okay, and then the other 2/3 is the inorganic components. Okay, so this is calcium phosphate salts. Right, so this is what gives the stiffness and durability to bone. Okay, and really it's a balance between the organic portion and the inorganic portion that's going to dictate how stiff versus how flexible any given bone is. Okay, this is an image of a bone without any of the organic components, right? It's just like a crystallized salt, right? But so it's the mix of those two types, the inorganic and organic components that really gives bone its strength plus flexibility. Okay, so let's take a look at the 4 cell types we'll talk about that we find inside bone. Okay, so we've got osteocytes. We've talked about some of these prefixes and suffixes already. Osteoblasts, osteogenic cells, and then osteoclasts. Okay, yeah, go ahead and talk with the people on your team. See if you can match these up. Okay, so we've got yeah, one of those letters is going to answer each of those questions, and then the one with the asterisk by it there will be the one I want you to send on your clickers. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Like, it's already clear. Like, it's been long. And then the same thing. No, just.
Yeah.
My favorite part of it's like.
So that's when you're sending in there, really that reabsorb means, it's like breaking down bone is what that means, right? All right, give you about 5 more seconds. A few more of you need to send in your answer there. Okay. Okay, so most of you said D, the osteoclast. Okay, let's start out with the first one there. So osteocyte, these are just our basic bone cells that maintain the matrix. So our first one there, cells responsible for maintaining the matrix are osteocytes. Okay, osteoblasts are the ones that are going to create the bony matrix to begin with. Okay, and so yeah, those ones are here, responsible for making the matrix here. Okay, osteogenic cells, which is are the ones that are going to make new cells for us constantly. Okay, and these are found in the membrane. So we have that. We'll talk about another membrane on the inside of the cavity of bone, the endosteum, and then also on the outside, the one we already talked about, that periosteum. That's where we're going to find those osteogenic cells. Okay, and then finally, osteoclasts are the ones that are going to resorb bone or break down bone, and yeah, so that one is D. Okay, osteoclasts are unique cells in that there's a few cells in the body that are multinucleated. Okay, so these big things here are all different nuclei, right? So they have more than one nucleus. Skeletal muscle cells are that way too. Skeletal muscle cells can have hundreds of thousands of nuclei per cell, but osteoclasts are another example of that. And the main reason for that is because they need to make so many proteins, right? The big thing they do is make a ton of enzymes that then have the power to go in and break down bone. And so they kind of just attach to bone like this little, I don't know, amoeba looking thing. And then they create a seal around the bone where they're attached to it. And then they just release all these super strong enzymes and chemicals that just breaks down that bony matrix, and they suck up the calcium and phosphate and can release that into the bloodstream. So we constantly have a balance of osteoclastic activity versus osteoblastic activity, which is constantly what's happening when we're remodeling our bone in that continual process. So questions about that? All right, so those are our 4 primary bone cells. Okay, let's look a little bit at the microanatomy of compact bone. Okay, so compact bone, this is the stuff on the outside, right? The part that didn't have bone marrow in it, just very dense. If you zoom in even a little bit closer, then you'll see what we have is this structure called the osteon. Okay, so these little osteons are these overlapping cylinders that kind of get bigger and bigger as they overlap each other. But then there's a central canal inside of each one, and this is where you have blood vessels and nerves that pass through. Okay, but then you can see these little diagonal lines are where the collagen is found. Okay, and then we can also see these little cells here, which are all osteocytes. Okay, all those little spider-like looking cells are all osteocytes, and you can see that there's like little, spider web looking little tentacles that come off of them. Those all in one way or another connect to the central canal. Okay, because you can imagine as a bone cell creates that matrix around itself, then it pretty much just traps itself in, which would then kind of trap itself away from the blood supply and oxygen supply. But then there's these little tiny canals called canaliculi, which connect each cell with a little fluid-filled canal all the way back to the central canal where the blood supply is. Okay, this whole thing is called the Haversian system. Again, that's central canal, blood vessels, nerves. It's lined with endosteum, which is the membrane inside of that canal. Okay, and then the lamellae are the little sections here that we can see. These little portions where the collagen and calcium phosphate are. Really, it's each cylinder is called a lamellae. Okay, and that's what that is. Okay, and then again, those osteocytes are in those little lacunae we talked about before, those little cells, and connect to each other and the central canal via canaliculi, which just means like mini canal. Okay, these are another example of cells that have gap junctions, so they can connect right to each other. They can share nutrients with each other, as well as waste products. Okay, take a sec and fill in your answers here, and you can answer the one there on the bottom on your clickers. Yeah, so based on the structures from the previous slide, should be able to label most of those things.
Yeah, I think it's.
So make sure to hit send with this type of question. Since F is an option, I have to make it a short answer one. So make sure to hit the send button. All right, I'll give you about 15 more seconds. There's about at least 10 or so more of you that need to send it. Make just everybody hit the send button to make sure it went in. All right, looks like we're almost there. Okay, so we're kind of at a mix between D, C, and B for your answers. We got about a third of you saying each of those. So let's walk through them. So A is just that central canal of one of those osteons. Okay, so and so you can just imagine that compact bone is just a bunch of those cylindrical structures that are overlapping each other with central canals that have blood vessels and bone, or blood vessels and nerves. Okay, B is just one of those full osteons. Right. C is a different type of lamellae called circumferential lamellae that wrap around the whole outside of the bone, right? So those ones don't actually have the central canals, right? It's just a whole thing that goes around the whole bone. And then D would be the lamellae that we saw on the previous one. Each of those overlapping cylinders are the lamellae, kind of the typical lamellae there. Okay, and then you can see with E, we don't just have those canals going the length of the bone. We also have what's called perforating canals, which allows blood vessels to go deeper into the bone, not just longitudinally, but then go in towards the cavity in the center of the bone as well. Yeah, so that one was that one D? Was that this one? Yeah, D right there. Yeah. So that was D. Okay, and then lastly, that membrane on the very outside there, we get a nicer view of it here. That's the periosteum, so we can see all three, a bundle, what's called a neurovascular bundle. We'll see this all through the body. You'll start seeing these more when you get into the muscles in the cats. This is just how it works. Typically, you have a vein, artery, nerve. They travel together all the time. It's considered a neurovascular bundle. Okay, questions about that? All right. Okay, so this is just kind of zooming in a little bit closer. I like this image because you can see the canaliculi a little bit better. So we can see our osteocytes here, right? And then we can see if you follow these little canals, right, they're eventually either connecting to this one, and that one connects to this one, and then that one eventually gets in here where we have some diffusion space where nutrients can pass back and forth, right? And so we would have gap junctions between the kind of the arms of the osteocytes, and then eventually we can pass nutrients all the way from the blood vessel to all of the cells that are far away from that blood vessel. Okay, it's kind of a cool little system to solve the problem of how do we get oxygen and glucose and things like that through a rock hard structure, right? Okay, all right, this is the image that you guys have already seen, right? That microscopic image of bone tissue, right? But now maybe it makes a little bit more sense as to what stuff is, right? We can see a central canal, right? We can see the lamellae, we can see nuclei of osteocytes there, right? Yeah, so and all the little kind of like fibril-like stuff there in the middle, those are most likely all little canaliculi connecting those cells together. So, okay. All right. Okay, so that was compact bone, spongy bone. This is a kind of a close-up image of spongy bone. It's much lighter than compact bone. Okay, it looks like it's kind of random, just arms going every different direction. Those arms are called trabeculae. Okay, and those trabeculae actually are aligned based on the stress that bone typically receives. Okay, so this is the part of bone that's easily turned over by osteoclasts and osteoblasts. And so, for example, they've done studies where they look at the trabeculae in a certain bone that's not under much stress, and then they kind of put that bone under a lot of stress of a certain type of lifting of weights or swinging of a racket or something like that. And the trabeculae actually completely rearrange themselves to be aligned in the right direction to withstand that exact type of force that's been being put on the bone. So very dynamic tissue to deal with that exact line of stress that you would normally have. We don't have central blood vessels in these, but still there are osteocytes all throughout, and then little canaliculi connecting all of them to each other there. Okay, questions on any of that? Go ahead. Easily what? Turned by. Oh, yeah, it's much more easily turned over, meaning that like we can break it down and then build it back up quicker than we can compact bone. Yeah, so yeah, kind of that turnover rate of tissue is like that idea of breaking it down and then building it back up in a different way to be able to withstand a certain force. So yeah, great question. Other questions? Go ahead. Exactly. Yep. Only in spongy bone. Yep. Good question. Other questions? Okay. All right, well, let's look at some of those broader terms of when we're looking at a long bone. We have a few structures that ways that we identify different parts of it. So I already mentioned before, but the diaphysis of a bone is kind of the this whole center part of the bone. Okay, right here in the middle. It always has a collar of compact bone. Okay, so the outside's compact bone, and then in the middle, it's actually a cavity known as the medullary cavity. So it's really hollow in the middle. It's not just solid. Okay, so solid on the outside, hollow in the middle. You can see that here, right? In most of the time, that's filled with yellow marrow in adults, right? In kids, then it's red marrow, but in adults, it's yellow marrow. Okay, and then the ends of bone, as you can see here, these are called epiphyses. Oops, sorry, that is the shaft. And then the ends are called epiphyses. Again, they have a shell of compact bone, but then they don't have cavities, right? It's not hollow on the outside there, on the ends there. It's filled with spongy bone. And this is typically where we're going to have red bone marrow. Okay. And then right there, dividing the two in most cases, or kind of somewhere in different spots, depending on the bone, you have what's called the epiphyseal line. And that's the growth plate. Okay. If your growth plates haven't closed yet and your bones are still growing, then this will show up as a complete gap in an x-ray, right? Because there's no bone there, it's cartilage. It'll actually just be two completely separate bones, right? But in adults, it shifts away from being cartilage and becomes compact bone instead. So it's kind of like the remnants of your growth plate is known as the epiphyseal line. Okay, so it's hyaline cartilage while it's growing, but then replaced with bone, and it becomes this line that we can see there. Okay. All right. So that's a bit of the anatomy, a little bit more of the anatomy of those long bones. If we zoom in a little bit on those membranes, we've already been talking about the periosteum. Periosteum is the outer lining of bone. Connective tissue, again, it's that dense, irregular connective tissue. And then a bunch of cells. This is where we have osteoblasts, clasts, osteogenic cells. Okay. This is where we get lots of tensile strength from the bone. This is where ligaments and tendons fuse with bone. Okay. So ligaments that are holding our bones together that we sprain when we roll our ankle, right? Those are fused right into our periosteum of our bone. So it just kind of makes this like woven structure. And we typically don't rip that part off of the bone. Typically the ligament in the middle will break. It's a very strong, firmly held structure to the bone. Okay. But this is also, where entry of blood vessels and nerves occurs. Okay. And then the endosteum is really just the same idea, CT as in connective tissue on the inside, right? So same idea as a periosteum, but it's on the inside of the cavity instead. Okay. And then we got this hematopoietic tissue, which really just means bone cell formation tissue. This is stem cell type tissue that's going to make red blood cells as well as white blood cells. Okay, so we find this in spongy bone when we're talking about flat bones and irregular bones in the medullary cavity of the epiphyses of long bones. Okay, and then in babies, also in the diaphysis part, right? Also in the middle. Okay, but in adults, it's just on the ends. Okay. And then lastly, just the anatomy of these other types of bones, flat bones, short bones, irregular bones. It kind of makes this sandwich, right? We've got periosteum on the outside. Okay. Got some compact bone there. Then we got endosteum right here. Right. And then we got a bunch of spongy bone. And then it starts over. Then we got endosteum, compact bone, periosteum. Right. So that's just kind of the basic setup of that structure. So no open cavity inside of these bones like we do in long bones. All right, guys, got done a little bit early today. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday. Bye-bye.
For this part,
Uh-huh. Hold on.
how did